Do you have a 2005 to 2009 Mustang? And do you have people who ride in the back? Then you might want to consider building one of these. Watch as I modify my 2007 Mustang center console to add in rear seat cup holders. In this two-part series, I lay out all the materials, measurements, and tips to inspire you to build one for yourself. In part 1, I removed the console and drew the rough outline of the work, making measurements and cuts, adding a panel and brackets to hold the cup holder in place. In part 2, I make more cuts and shape fiberglass sections to the back of the console, finishing off the area with some body filler before adding the finishing touches to make this console look and function better than stock. You can take the build as far as you want, so please watch and enjoy. Thank you. Hello everyone. So I have a 2007 Mustang GT with 169,000 miles on it that I've owned since new. It's my daily driver, and also my weekend drift car, as I'm learning the sport with my car club. My daughter has grown up in this car. We've taken it everywhere. Now that she's reached the age where she doesn't need a child car seat anymore, she misses having her cup holders that were standard in those car seats. Plus, she wants to drive too, but that's another video. I haven't found anything out there on the internet that works as an option, or that I find appealing, so I decided to build something, not knowing how it would come out. Why not? It's plastic. It's not the end of the world if I mess up. I just let go of the fear and moved on forward. So what I did was buy a used cup holder assembly from a 2000 to 2004 Subaru Outback or Legacy. Being also a Subaru nerd, I knew it could be a really good option, for it has a compact design, and since I had my center console out once before, I knew there was dead space right after the storage area. So after taking some quick measurements, I was encouraged by my car club to film my build and show you all what I did. To remove the console, you start with the top assembly, which has 2 screws at the back and the rest is clipped into place and pulls right off. I then remove the 2 console side panels, which are toward the front of the console, which are held in by clips and slide right out. Remove the 2 7mm bolts at the front and the 2 10mm bolts that are inside the storage area. Unplug the cigarette lighter, then simply lift the console out of the car. So I wanted to approach this build in the minimalist way possible. I tried to use things I figured most of you could have or could borrow easily. The expensive part of this build mainly comes from the cup holder, which I scored on eBay for $30. Materials like metal, riv nuts, fiberglass, paint, screws, are things you might have around your place, but being cost conscious, I'm sure you can keep the cost under $100. Here are all the items that I ended up using. A cup holder from a 2000 to 2004 Subaru Outback or Legacy, an aluminum flat bar, 1/8 inch by 1 inch, about 1 foot length, some 22 gauge aluminum sheet metal, and some 18 gauge sheet metal. You would need about 12 by 12 inches. You need a Dremel cutting discs, and a routing tool would be helpful. Some pliers, screwdrivers, a socket wrench and sockets, specifically a 5.5mm or 732 if you don't have that, a 7mm and a 10mm. A drill and drill bits. The size I used was a 1/4 inch and 25/64 inch. Depending on what size screws and riv nuts you use, you might use something different. I used 1/4 inch by 20 screws, about 3/4 inch in length. You probably can get away with about 1/2 inch. I used 3/4 inch and I trimmed them down to fit. I used 1/4 inch by 20 riv nuts, a riv nut tool, a hacksaw, some cutting shears, some files, a flat and a round one. I had the use of my vise and a workbench, but a table would do just good with some vise grips to hold things down. I used a fiberglass kit made by 3M, which is an 8-ounce kit, which had plenty of material to do this. I also had some body filler, 3M number 310, just a small 12-ounce kit, some spray paint, masking tape and cardboard. I used some sprayable bed liner, but you could also use some fabric adhesive and vinyl or leather fabric to finish the build, which will be covered in part 2 of the series. And of course, the necessary things like safety glasses, disposable gloves, work gloves, and some fresh ventilation, especially when doing the fiberglass and body filler, because that stuff is nasty. And again, this list for you may change as you have other size screws or riv nuts laying around you want to use, or different thicknesses of sheet metal that you have, etc. The idea is use what you have and make it fun. So I started out using some masking tape to mark out the area where I wanted the cup holder to be. The area I started with was about 4.5 inches tall by 4 3/4 inches wide. I knew I would be cutting off more of the area later on. I just wanted to start with a smaller area first and then go bigger later. As you can see from the bottom of the console, there's plenty of space. There's about 6 inches from the back of the storage area to the end of the console, about 9 inches side to side in width, and 5 inches of space from the top area of the console to where the transmission tunnel is, so there's definitely some space to work with. The Subaru cup holder is compact in design and has some cool factory mounting tabs that I wanted to utilize. When opened, it's about 6 inches long by 4 1/4 inches tall and about 4 3/4 inches wide. I knew it would fit in there, I just had to start cutting. Looking underneath, I noticed I had to trim down these 3 rails that are on the back side of the console storage area that are there for strength. Figuring I was putting in a solid object with brackets, I wasn't worried about breaking anything. I also know I need to make a small cut to the inside of the storage area for the tension spring of the cup holder, as it sticks out. But I figured on making a panel to cover that area up on the inside of the console. I also have to trim down these little circle areas for clearance, being careful not to cut deep, as they are the areas for the screws that hold down the console top lid. Marking out the area to cut out a big section of the plastic is next. So, with my safety glasses on, I grabbed the Dremel and started with the basic straight cuts. Nothing exciting, just straight cuts, to get the area exposed to see the area inside. Being conservative on how much I was cutting off, not going wide just yet. Once opened, I could see the flat back area of the console and how I would fit the cup holder in, which I will have to paint to match later on. Perhaps you will score one that is black already. I will say the Dremel is the tool of choice for this job. It's easy to get in all the tight places. I'm going at a medium speed of 6 on the Dremel, cleaning off the excess plastic as I go. Just be careful that the plastic you cut off the console will melt as you are cutting, and it may gum up the mandrel. The reinforced cutting discs work great for both cutting and grinding. You can get away with the standard discs, just at a slower pace. If you don't have a Dremel, borrow one from a friend, buy a Dremel kit with a few friends to share with, or buy one for your own. I've used it for so many car or home projects. It's one of the tools I'm glad to own. I did some cutting and fitting as I went through this process, not trying to do it all in one shot. I was taking some time visually to make sure I was going in the right direction, seeing the cup holder inside and opening and closing it, and looking at all the options that were going to be available for me. So as I have it roughly put in, I can see that I like where the direction is going. On the top end of the console, I need to shave these 3 little nubs down so that the cup holder will lay flat alongside the top side. Being careful not to shave down too deep, as I mentioned before, they hold the screws in for the lid. Now that I have it roughed out, I put the console back in the car with the cup holder placed inside to get an idea of what I've gotten myself into. I like the clearance it had with the seat. I know it was going to be 6 inches to the seat when fully extended, and it will gain a bit more room when it's all held in place properly. In my opinion, Ford missed their mark when they designed this, as they could have easily done this, but they probably didn't imagine anyone would ride in the back seat, let alone people who had kids. Oh well, my daughter's worth it, and I like a project, so now I have the first proof of concept. Next, I removed the console top lid bolts with a 5.5mm socket and set them aside. You could also use a 732 if you don't have a 5.5mm. Flipping the console over, I have to shave down these 3 rails to make them flush with the back. I need to trim out these rounded areas as I intend to make a bracket to lock in the cup holder with the factory cup holder mounting tabs. With safety glasses on, I started cutting out the thicker parts to remove a bunch of material. Take your time as the disc may start to gum up with the heated plastic. I used the edge of the cutting disc to cut out the bottom little sections, and used the edge of the disc as well to smooth out the flat areas on the back side of the console area. Fitting the cup holder in, I made a center mark with a paint marker to transfer over to the console mounting area, as well as making a mark for the cutout I needed to do for the tension spring on the cup holder. Using the cutoff wheel to make an initial cut, I switched out to a routing bit to cut out a rectangular area. Now you can see how the cup holder will be held in against the console area. What I'm going to be doing is fabricating a bracket that will lock in and support the bottom of the cup holder using the factory tabs and attach it to the console with some rivnuts. So with some scrap 22 gauge sheet metal I had lying around, I cut out a 4" by 4.5" section as a template. This being really flexible, I could easily bend and use as a template. You might have this type of metal laying around your garage or at a buddy's house. It's cheap at the hardware store, or even try buying off scrap pieces at a local metal supply house. I made a little notched bend in the top of the metal so it will attach to the tabs in the bottom of the cup holder. I then made some points of reference for bends that I could make in my vise to get the shape of the bracket. As I'm fitting the bracket in, I am making note that I need to trim down these 3 little ends so I can make the bracket contoured with the console. Easy work with the Dremel, trim and smoothed out nicely. As you can see, I bent the bracket to match the contour of the console. And since this is just a temp bracket, I know there will be some massaging when I make the final one. But this gives me a great visual of how it would look and fit with no obstructions to the transmission tunnel when it is done. But let's lock in the top first. I need to drill 2 1/4" holes in the top of the cup holder for the screws to go through that will attach to the top part of the console. Using 1/4" by 20 rivnuts from my rivnut case, signed by Formula Drift driver Matt Field. Thank you, Matt Field. I need to drill 2 holes in the top of the console for the rivnuts to pass through, as I will be attaching the rivnuts to a piece of aluminum flat stock to hold the cup holder in place. I'll explain why. Originally, I was just going to attach the rivnuts directly to the console. After testing the rivnut on a piece of the scrap console plastic, you can see how the plastic is stretching, and after time that will eventually fail. I decided to use a piece of 1/8" by 1" aluminum flat stock I had, and we'll have the rivnuts attached to that, and we'll have the cup holder pull the bar against the inside of the console storage area. It's not like that I expect 40-ounce big gulps jammed in these cup holders, but if I have to build it once, then I'll build it once. So I drilled the 1/4" holes in the top of the cup holder, and I cleaned up the edges with a flat and round file. Then I fitted against the console so I could make my marks to drill through the console. I drilled 2 25 by 64" holes in the console, then transferred those measurements to my flat stock, and then went to work on making the holes for the rivnuts, filing down the rough edges and inside of the holes. I then attached the rivnuts to the aluminum flat stock with a minimal amount of bending which I was able to hammer out. Now you can see how the plate will attach to the inside of the console and hold the cup holder in place. I still have to trim down the screws to be flush with the rivnuts, and I will be covering up the bar and cup holder tension spring later on with a panel I will fabricate. The cup holder is working just fine, so it's time to finish up making the bottom bracket. I am using 18 gauge sheet metal to make this bracket. I cut a piece of 4" by 4.5" to start with, and I transferred over my measurements from the temp piece. I went to work with the vise and metal hammer to get this first notch bend that will be locked into the tabs of the cup holder. I used the top of the vise and the back pad to help massage the metal, as this takes a little time, so I made the first bend, and now I'm making marks for the second bend. I intentionally cut the piece of metal long so I could cut off what I didn't need versus coming up short after all the bends and having to start all over again. Here you can see the bracket fabbed up with just a little room for the rivnuts. I then made 2 25 by 64" holes in the bracket and inserted the 2 rivnuts. I then transferred the measurements of the holes to the console and drilled 2 1/4" holes for the screws. Lining up the bracket, I can insert the screws from the inside of the console into the bracket with the rivnuts, which is now attached to the cup holder using the factory tabs from Subaru. Flipping the console over, you can see how it is shaping up, and the cup holder opening and closing easily. I still need to trim those screws out on the top of the console, and just massage that flat bar a bit more to make it straighter, which all will be covered up with a piece of sheet metal later on. With the console back in the car, you can see when it's opened, it comes right to the edge of the seat and you have room with the cup holders. Now, leaving the holder down, you could leave the console just like this. Just smooth out the outside edges and fit it with some plastic edging strips and call it a day. it would work and still be okay. I decided to go a step further, but that will happen in the second part of this build. Thanks for watching. Stick around for part 2, and if you like it or not, let me know by liking, subscribing, and leaving some comments. Thanks, everyone.